Yeah, so our objective was to identify the key barriers in clinical development and present solutions for the future. And we concentrated on two areas. The first area was on clinical trials more broadly, and the second area was on some of the issues with disharmony in safety reporting requirements, particularly, and what we concentrated was on the pre-marketing side of things. So first, to review some of the barriers. I think the barriers were discussed this morning and earlier this afternoon with a larger group, but I'll review some of them because it gets into some of the solutions. So for in developing countries, some of the barriers that were identified were a problem with identifying what are the specific requirements for the different countries if you're doing a multi-regional clinical trial. There was a lack of transparency, in particular regarding timelines, and in some cases there was a lack of regulations in certain countries, and there may be in some cases disorganization in the part of a regulatory authority that caused a barrier to conducting clinical trials. In addition, I think there was sometimes a lack of clarity between what the responsibilities would be in a particular country for the regulatory authority versus the ethics committees that were overseeing the clinical trials. And there were overlap and some of the redundancies and the work that was being done by both parties was felt to be inefficient. Another thing that was discussed was a lack of transparency in the country's regulations. I think I had mentioned this. It was hard to find. In addition, there are cultural differences in conducting clinical trials in different regions. There are bureaucratic obstacles. There was sometimes a lack of understanding was what worked in a particular country to get your clinical trial approved. In addition, there were language barriers that caused some difficulty in getting the clinical trials going forward. One of the issues that was mentioned, or at least was that there is a need to provide clarity in order to make progress on overcoming the barriers. And one of the discussants had presented that there were really three levels of barriers. One was at the regulatory authority level themselves, differences in the regulations, differences in the way the regulators worked. There's also, in conducting a clinical trial, issues of how the clinical trial is overseen or monitored. And then there are also barriers at the actual site of the study, and all of those three levels have to be addressed. One of the other issues that was discussed was that, and this is true for both developing but also for the developed world, is that there are specific programmatic issues that can be barriers. So there may be differing requirements for pediatric drug development. In particular, what was mentioned was differences in the EU and the US. There were differences in approaches in choosing active comparators, differences in approaching for dose finding, differences in treatment effect and how to deal with a treatment effect heterogeneity. One of the other barriers was lack of site capacity, particularly in neglected diseases and in developing countries. So in looking at all those barriers, we came up with a few ways and a few ways that folks have known to overcome them based on their own personal experience or based on suggestions. And so the first was to develop a map of regulatory requirements in the different countries. And so there was some discussion back and forth about how best to do this. What was mentioned was that, and there's one organization, the Global Health Technologies Coalition, has come up with a map, a description of regulatory requirements for 10 developing countries. But no sooner do you get that map done is the requirements change, and it's very intensive to keep updating that. So the suggestion was made to actually put the onus on the specific regulators themselves to update their website and to find ways to facilitate them to update their website so the regulatory requirements would be there. Another suggestion was to do a root cause analysis for the different harmonizations, and some discussion occurred with the idea of sovereignty and how are we going to overcome the barriers if one country insisted as a part of their sovereign responsibility that they do things differently. And so what was discussed was the need to be willing to compromise, the willingness to look at the outcome and to give up some control in order to come to either a convergence or a harmonized approach. Another thing that was discussed was with respect to the importance of assuring that there is high-quality data. And so again, if there are systems in place to assure high-quality data, that would help to make sure that the studies can be used, the results can be used from one regulator to another. And I think the final thing that was discussed there was an opportunity to harmonize over consent requirements, and this is would be a good outcome. So and then there was one other thing I wanted to mention was with respect to joint reviews, and these would be very helpful, particularly in neglected diseases in developing countries. So with respect to the EU experience, I think there were some positive experiences that were related. The ICH expansion to include outside the founding members was one positive. EU centralized procedures and the application was also a positive development. Parallel scientific advice between the EMA and the FDA, and harmonized approaches to patient-reported outcomes. So I can go on to safety reporting, or I can give a summary, and I'm going to ask Judy to chime in if she has some specific comments. But we did talk about some of the lack of harmonization between safety reporting requirements, specifically between the EU and the FDA. So we all know that ICH E2 is already in place, but in October 2010, the FDA released new rules for pre-marketing reporting requirements. And I think the fundamental differences, and the one that we spent the most time talking about, is with respect to causality assessment. In the U.S., we rely on sponsors for aggregating the adverse events and providing their assessment of causality and providing that information to the FDA. In the EU, they rely on both the causality assessment by the investigator and the sponsor. This clearly provides a problem for sponsors because in trying to report in a uniform and efficient way, they have two sets of requirements they have to adapt to. And so one potential solution that was discussed within the context of the smaller group was that there was an opportunity for conversions, if not harmonization. And within the EU, there was a discussion, there's a discussion that they can actually, within the protocol, declare certain anticipated events that would not have to be reported. And this would greatly decrease the number of adverse events that were reported. Overall, what was stressed was a need to focus on patient safety, and there was in this now an opportunity to set a more clear threshold for reporting serious and unexpected AEs. And I think the one last thing I would mention, and I know I'm running out of time, was the opportunity to further develop in the area of risk communication in clinical trials, and this was felt to be something that could be accomplished with respect to a Q&A rather than a full ICH guidance document. Okay, and that's it.
Great. Thank you, Leslie. We really only have about 2 minutes, but if there is a point just for clarification on the findings of that group, I'd be happy to take that question now. Otherwise, I will move on as we hurdle through these regulatory areas. Great. Then, Andy.